What's up guys, Jabrel here from Neo Vintage Games, and I got another collection video for you guys. Now for y'all who don't know, basically what we do in these videos is I go generation by generation, go over the console, the controllers, the different peripherals, give you guys a little bit of background and history on the console, go through my games in that for that collection, and then we kind of just chill, take 20 minutes or so to just relax and talk games. So this is an interesting generation here. So finally we're doing the N64. This is probably going to be the last console generation I do for a couple of weeks while I go to the handhelds. I'm gonna do like Game Boy. I'm gonna do, obviously color will be integrated into that. I'm gonna do my advanced collection, and then maybe from there I'll make the jump to like GameCube and PS2 and stuff like that. But yeah, so let's get into the N64. The interesting thing about this came out in 1996 in both Japan and the United States. Interesting thing about this is the 5th generation, so it went against the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn. Obviously, Sega had its own kind of set of issues for that. But Nintendo made some interesting decisions this generation, so they opted to continue going with cartridge-based games when, for the most part, the industry moved on to CD-ROMs. And in many ways, that kind of bit them in the butt at that time. A lot of developers like Square Enix ended up actually jumping to PlayStation just because of the limitations of what cartridges can actually hold. But it's kind of a generation that holds a lot of love in people's hearts, and I got a lot of love for this generation as well. Now, admittedly, this is a generation that I experienced after the fact. I did not have an N64 growing up. I got this when I was much older, probably. I picked this up maybe 5 years ago or so. So since then, I've experienced a lot of the games retroactively. My friend had N64, I had the PS1, and another friend of mine actually had the Saturn going into the Genesis. So we all kind of got to lightly experience the different console generations. So here's the console. I kind of have the base charcoal black unit here. Got the good leg. Great build on this console. I've always really enjoyed the form factor of the N64. Interesting thing about the N64 is the console generation, for the most part, ran from 96 to about 2001, 2002, right after the GameCube came out. So it didn't have an incredibly long life cycle. And they didn't do any real major hardware revisions on this. Instead, they opted for like expansions and extensions of power, much like the Genesis did with their like 32X and stuff like that. There is the 64DD, which is the disk drive for the N64. I actually don't have one of those, unfortunately. We also have the memory expansion pack. That was an interesting thing. So basically there are memory limitations on this console. So what they opted to do was release this expansion pack that you could buy. You could still find them around for anywhere from like $30 to $50. So they're a little bit on the pricier edge. But they're really great to have, and only a couple games actually utilize this extra memory that this provides. The ones that I can remember offhand, I know that Donkey Kong 64 uses it, Majora's Mask, and I believe actually Perfect Dark and maybe the Resident Evil 2 port also use this expansion pack's added memory. So it's limited, but it's some of the best games on the consoles that actually utilize this. So if you're looking to start collecting for the N64, I highly suggest you try to track one of these down. I don't think these are like very finicky units. I don't think they like break super easy or anything like that. So I don't think you have to worry about that too much. So yeah, this is the general form factor of the console. Now we can go onto the controller. Now, before I get into the controller, this is a generic version. I don't actually have like an official N64 controller, but obviously this has the matching form factor of it. Interesting thing about this is it does have like a memory card port in the back. I don't have a memory card, so sorry about that. Really interesting form factor. Probably Nintendo's weirdest controller to date. There's a lot of weird things about like the GameCube, for example, but it has like that amazing feel in the hand that people are not as critical about it. The N64 is a lot more hit or miss for people. Single joy stick right here in the center here. In retrospect, when you feel it, it's not as like snappy and smooth as a lot of the modern ones are, but for the time it was pretty revolutionary. You also have like a trigger there on the back, so that was always really interesting. And the cool thing about the N64 controller is, judging by your hand shape and how you like to play games, it can be played multiple ways. Now, some people choose to hold it from the center portion and kind of play like this, or you can get like a wider grip like here, and if you have the large enough hands, you can have access to everything. But again, if you have smaller hands, you could hold it from the center. A lot of kids, I would imagine, held it like that, and depending on what type of games you're playing will kind of dictate what style you'd like to hold for this. Now, because I didn't grow up with the N64, I don't have like a lot of nostalgia for this controller, so luckily we have something cool here. We have the Retro Fighter controller that I really enjoy. I believe this is a My Arcade The Brawler 64, yeah, or Retro Fighters actually did this, not my arcade. Really enjoy this controller. Basically all it is it takes the N64 controller and kind of mushes it down to kind of like a modern form factor. So it's way more comfortable for my kind of like modern sensibilities, because again, I'm going back to this generation. So it was a little bit difficult for me to play games with this controller. So I was really glad to get that. So if you're looking to start collecting for the N64 and you're not like super fond of that original controller and like three-pronged approach, you always have this as an option. It moves the analog to the side here. And yeah, it's a pretty good controller. It has a turbo button, start, clear, A, B, all the direction stuff. So it has everything you'd want here. And now we can just get into the games. Now my N64 collection is not the biggest in the world, but I think I have like a lot of the heavy hitters on there. So for the most part, everything that I wanted on the N64, I was able to get. Nothing was super expensive. Obviously you have games like Harvest Moon. I believe there's a Harvest Moon on N64. Conker's Bad Fur Day. There's some really expensive N64 games, but for the most part, most of the games that are really worth playing on this console are pretty well priced. So let's get into it. To start, we have Banjo-Kazooie, an amazing 3D action platformer kind of game. It's also a collectathon. For you non-Nintendo people, it's similar in a vein to like maybe like a Spyro, for example. And yeah, man, revolutionary game. Not a game that like I super love, but it's a must-have for anybody. One, who's a Rare fan, two, who is collecting for N64, and three, who also wants to know the heritage of like 3D platformers in the Nintendo space. You gotta play Banjo-Kazooie. It's an absolute classic, and there's a lot of great things. I think a lot of the visuals, because of the cartoony aesthetic of this game, hold up really well. So I'm really glad to have this in the collection. Also, there is a sequel, Banjo-Tooie, I believe, and then there's another one that was a next-gen game. So yeah, Banjo-Kazooie, absolute classic. The next one is an interesting game because, you know, this is one of my favorite franchises ever, if you follow this channel at all. It's the Castlevania 64 game. Now, this game, I have to admit, is not good at all. Now, some people I know have a lot of love for it, especially if they grew up with it. This game, my sensibilities are very much towards Castlevania 1, 3, Symphony of the Night, Rondo of Blood, Bloodlines on Genesis. Like, those are the ones that I like. Super Castlevania 4. The 3D one is not really my cup of tea, but there's a lot of interesting stuff they were doing, especially like aesthetically and kind of translating game and making the jump to the 3D space. And that's the interesting thing about this generation, both on the 64 and the PlayStation, is that they were taking a lot of existing franchises and new IPs and learning how to adapt them into that 3D space. And it wasn't really mastered until, you know, years later after this generation. But a lot of them were kind of like working out the kinks. And so, you know, Castlevania in many ways is kind of a remnant of that era, of them just trying to figure out how to translate especially Castlevania to a 3D environment. And you see them got a lot better, especially on the PS2 iterations of Castlevania, got a lot better. But this one kind of like laid the groundwork for it. And then for the people who like Lords of Shadows, for some people, the 3D kind of Castlevania aesthetic and vibe and gameplay was kind of mastered over there much later. But you got to give Castlevania 64 their credit for what they were trying to do. The next one is, unfortunately, a kind of like forgotten franchise by Nintendo. They don't really seem to show it too much love, but it's F-Zero X. Now, this is a game I really love. All the F-Zero games, in my opinion, hold up really well. There's something about like that super smooth frame rate, whatever engine that they developed this game for, it holds up amazingly. High frame rate, high fast gameplay. And yeah, it just holds up amazingly, just like the original one. And this one is just, you know, a 3D version of it. If you're a big fan of like Wipeout, for example, you gotta give F-Zero a try, man. They did a fantastic job with these games. The next one is one of my favorites. It's Kirby 64, the Crystal Shards. I love the label on this one. Really colorful, fun game. For me, of like the 3D Kirby games, and again, this is 3D in terms of models, not 3D in terms of environments. This is as good as it gets for me. I really enjoy this game. Again, I'm by no means like a Kirby expert or something like that, but I've played a lot of the newer ones. I played the Game Boy Advance ones and the GameCube ones, and this is my personal favorite. I just love the aesthetic of it. I love the different characters. I love the world. It still plays real fun. I kind of like just all the different narrative choices they made in this game, and I just really enjoy it. I think it holds up really well. It's a really fun game. And it's fun in the same way that it's like the Yoshi games, where they're not particularly that challenging, But if you could just kind of get lost in that world and kind of sit back, relax, and just enjoy it for what it's offering. This one is an absolutely revolutionary game, another rare game. We got Perfect Dark here. Now, for y'all who don't know, this is a first-person shooter on the 64. Now, obviously, with exception for like Doom and Wolfenstein, first-person shooters weren't really mastered until years later. I feel like Halo was that major jump that, you know, and then those games before that you have to give the credit, like the Golden Eyes, obviously, which unfortunately I don't have on cartridge. I really need to get that one soon, as long as I can find it for a decent price. But games like Medal of Honor, GoldenEye, those were ones that were like early 3D shooters that deserve their credit. Obviously, Doom and Wolfenstein are on their own low level, and those are like ones that I still return to fairly regularly. Perfect Dark was kind of doing that on the Nintendo console. It hasn't held up amazingly, but it's kind of like something that you got to give its credit. It did have a sequel, Perfect Dark Zero, which is available on the Xbox One backwards compatibility right now. I think it was an Xbox exclusive, if I'm not mistaken. So that made an interesting jump because Microsoft did buy out Rare. It's also included in the Rare collection. A fun game to go back to for like kind of like an archivist, historical understanding where Nintendo was at the time kind of perspective, but it doesn't hold up the best in terms of like gameplay. It falls in line with a lot of shooters at that time, especially like games like a Rainbow Six, for example. They're a little clunky, the cursor getting it lined up, the controls are not amazing, especially if you're playing on the original controller, but you got to give it its credit. And again, it's this generation was kind of plagued with that kind of like adjustment. It's kind of like a generation in between generations where they were done with the 16-bit era. They were moving into like 64-bit processors. They had all this power to work with, but not necessarily knowing how to perfect it and properly utilize these new engines that they were able to run. The next one we have is Pokemon Snap. Absolute classic. For you guys that don't know, you kind of like on rails. You're kind of like in imagine kind of a minecart situation, and you have a camera and you're just taking pictures of Pokemon. But it's really, really fun. Great kind of like arcadey style gameplay and points oriented system. And I think it just really, really holds up really well for what it is. For a Pokemon spin-off, I think it's a really solid entry. And for you Pokemon fans that haven't played this, you gotta go back and give this a shot. And again, affordable game. The next one is a really fun game as well, Pokemon Stadium. Unfortunately, I don't have Pokemon Stadium 2. I would love to get a copy of that eventually. This was kind of Pokemon's first jump into turn-based combat, non-spin-off. But it's spin-off in terms of like the game itself, but in terms of the gameplay style, it is kind of in line with the mainline games. But this was their kind of like first major jump into the console market, holding that same kind of format that they set up on the Game Boy. Fantastic game. I like it a lot. It's very limited in terms of like the amount of Pokemon, the amount of move sets. It's a very limited game, but it's something that I feel like without Pokemon Stadium, you don't get Pokemon Coliseum, and without Pokemon Coliseum, you don't get a lot of the modern Pokemon games that are currently running on console. So you gotta respect the journey that they went on for the time. Next one is Star Fox 64, one of my personal favorites. When I go back to Star Fox games, personally, I'm going back to this one. There are some good ones on the GameCube as well, if you're into like Star Fox Assault and stuff like that. But Star Fox 64 basically took a lot of the vibes of the original one and Star Fox 2, if you played that one on the SNES Classic and now available on the Switch. And basically just translate it into 3D graphics. Again, the original one was 3D, but it was 3D rendered in a 16-bit console. Here you have 3D in a 64-bit console, and they did a fantastic job in terms of kind of translating that world onto newer hardware. And to me, it's just kind of like more of a good thing. They took the original format, expanded it a little bit, made it a little bit prettier, and released it. And I think they did a really solid job for that. Again, not a game that I grew up with, but since returning back to the N64, this is one that I have a lot of love for. Next one is one of my personal favorite on the console. It is Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. Something that's actually getting a release on modern consoles recently. And so I was able to pick this one up, and the next game, which is Rogue Squadron, I was able to pick these two up on Instagram. Somebody was selling them. It was like 2 for $13 or something crazy. So a great deal on these. And again, these are not expensive games, but they're really fun. This one holds up. As the title suggests, it's a racer game based on Star Wars Episode 1's pod racing. You get a different number of like different pods and racers to choose from. And it's a really fun game, and I think it holds up really, really well. If you can get past some of like the more clunky control schemes, you can't play with the camera a whole bunch. The environments are pretty cool, but there's a lot to love about this game, so I would highly suggest you pick this up, especially if you're a Star Wars fan, and especially if you're a prequels fan, you gotta play this game. The next one is Star Wars Rogue Squadron. This is an absolute legendary game. Doesn't need too much of an intro. It did carry on to the GameCube with a sequel. Fantastic game. It's kind of like a dogfighting aerial combat type game. This one is not the best, obviously, in the franchise. The sequel is much better, in my opinion. But you got to give a lot of credit to this game and what they're able to do in terms of like the texture and that kind of like 3D environmental, in air, moving all around, free exploration type situation in the context of a fixed battle in a fixed environment. I think they did a lot of cool stuff on this, so I got to give a lot of credit. And I've always been someone who really appreciates when developers are able to extract as much power out of hardware as possible. And I feel like this game really pushes what the N64 was able to do, so shout out to them. The next one is arguably the best game on the console. Absolute classic, come on, Mario 64. One of the best 3D platformers of all time, still holds up fantastically, love all the environments. A game that if you never played this, you're missing out. Especially if you love 3D Mario, you gotta play where it started. And this game absolutely holds up amazingly. There is a pretty solid DS port as well that if you don't want to get the original 64 version, get that one. And that one holds up really, really well too. But again, an absolute must-have for the Nintendo 64. Laid the groundwork for where... Without this, you ain't getting no Odyssey. You're not getting any Super Mario Sunshine or Galaxy or 3D World, Land, whatever. This is where it all started, and I think this is honestly one of the best ones they've ever done. And I mean, that's a pretty amazing thing that, fast forward 20-something years later, the first one you did in that style of game is one of the best ones. I mean, gotta give Nintendo the credit. They absolutely knocked out of the park here. And now we have the last two, which are, again, some of my favorite games on the consoles. It's the two Zeldas, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Majora's Mask with the gold cart and Ocarina of Time with the gray cart. Two absolutely fantastic games, both amazing in their own regard. A debate, since they came out, which one's better. I personally go more towards Majora's Mask because I like that dark aesthetic. But man, Ocarina of Time, that open world that they did, Majora's Mask, the weight that they give to the narrative, absolutely fantastic games. Both have been since cleaned up and ported to the 3DS. Hopefully we can get an iteration of them on the Switch too. I'd love to replay them. But yeah, fantastic games that I absolutely love, and I'm super glad that I have in my collection. And to think that they had such a fast turnaround in between them, it's amazing. And obviously, for y'all who don't know, Majora's Mask reused a lot of the assets that they made for Ocarina of Time, but gave it a completely different story, a lot more weight. It's a way darker, scarier game. And they introduced a lot of different, mechanics in terms of like the moon dynamic. There's a lot of like time sensitive events now that Ocarina didn't really have, but Ocarina has this amazing open world that to this day holds up fantastically. And they introduced characters like Sheik and stuff like that in Ocarina of Time. So what a fantastic direction that Zelda went, just coming off A Link to the Past, jumping to these, like, it's just fantastic. So I gotta give them a lot of credit for that. Absolutely love those games. And again, my games fell down. So many great games on this console. And again, Nintendo made some interesting choices in terms of staying with cartridges that I think ultimately cost them the generation in terms of sales. But in terms of game impact, the impact of the N64 cannot be understated. And so much of what they set up with the N64 I felt like was perfected for the GameCube and allowed that one to do as well as it did. The N64 did get outsold ultimately, but they didn't sell insignificant numbers. By no means was this a console failure. And I got a lot of love for this console, and I'm glad to, have some games for it, and I'd love to expand my collection for that. So down below, if you enjoyed this video, tell me some of your favorite games on the N64. What do you think about this console generation? And would you like me to keep this series going? I've enjoyed doing them, and I hope you guys enjoy watching them. For y'all who don't know, I've done videos for this for the NES, the Super Nintendo, the Genesis, and now the N64. Next up, I will be doing the Game Boy. I don't have a ton of Game Boy games, but I'd love to, go over the different hardware revisions and stuff like that. And maybe I'll even bring in the Game Boy Advance for like some massive Nintendo handheld blowout for you guys. Maybe I'll do that. But if you guys are enjoying this little series that I'm doing, be sure to leave the comments and likes down below and share with people who you think enjoy retro games and who love the N64. Till next time, this is Jabril from Neo Vintage Games. Love you guys. Bye.